Welcome to the Lighthouse Conversations, a show featuring entrepreneurs and tastemakers from the world of art, culture, tech, and of course food. I'm your host, Hashem Matter. Like in 2021, we're kicking off the year with our year in review episode, for which I'm joined by our producer, Chirag.
Well, happy birthday, Hashem.
Thank you. I mean, you must know how special you are. The fact that on my birthday, I'm spending pretty much most of the afternoon with you.
I have a feeling, though, that when we scheduled this, you didn't know it was going to happen on your birthday.
That may or may not have been true, but the point is, I am here and it is my birthday.
That is very true.
You know what I mean? And and you even had like this mocktail wannabe cocktail 5 minutes ago, which I thought was great. It's something we're experimenting with. And here we are. So I'm all yours. What are we going to talk about today?
Well, I think since you mentioned we were sitting at the Lighthouse a little while ago, the Lighthouse turned 5, which is quite a milestone.
Thank you. It is incredible.
I remember I asked you in 2020, how did it feel when you got to 3 and 3.5 and 4? How does it feel at 5?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this 5 was, I think, particularly special because we've just opened 2 new locations back to back in the last week.
Yeah. So
it's been crazy fun in that sense. We opened in Spain, Abu Dhabi. We opened on the Palm Jumeirah and Nakhil Mall. So it feels like 5 is a milestone, but also the Lighthouse has grown and multiplied in many different ways, in a good way.
And last year you guys had the Mall of Emirates branch open.
And Mall of the Emirates opened in March of last year. So it really feels kind of like a very fitting birthday in that sense. You know, it's almost like it's your birthday, but you've had twins. So kind of thing. That's how it feels.
It's an interesting analogy.
Yeah, I mean, that's a little bit how it feels. And honestly, look, I mean, I can speak for the whole team. I mean, incredible team. Very gratified, obviously, to be in 4 different locations, 4 different identities, but all coexist under, that Lighthouse umbrella and with kind of a specific idea in mind, as you know. So look, it's been great. This is not an easy business to run by any stretch. Everybody knows that, especially the F&B part. But I think once you get over the hump, in some ways it starts getting easier. So so it's a very special period.
Yeah, which is great.
It is.
And then simultaneously we're kind of bringing it to the podcast. The podcast is a little over 2 years now. We're entering our 3rd. And so that's what I was kind of thinking about, because today that's what we want to do. We kind of want to go back, look at the last year, what we've done with the show. What stood out to me this year, which I think is interesting, is I feel like the show is kind of now has a very distinctive identity.
Settled.
Yeah, it's settled, right?
Yeah.
I was listening to our 2020 review to see kind of where we were a year ago. At that stage, I think we were not as sure as we are today when we look at some of what I call the basic tenets of the Lighthouse Conversations as a show, which sits on top of the Lighthouse, which I think some of the tenets are shared.
Correct.
But when you introduce the show, you always talk about arts, culture, tech, food.
Correct.
And I think underlying all of this is a little bit of entrepreneurship.
So to that point, I mean, I feel like the first year, to your point, it took us a year to find our voice. Certainly for me to find my voice in the first year. And I feel once I felt much more, and we talked about this last year and you brought up in your notes, this idea that, my nephew, amongst others, had told me, it's lovely, but it seems more like an interview and not a conversation. And I think it did take me about a year, and that's normal, to find the voice. The second year, I feel we settled and found our guest audience in terms of the people we are bringing to the show. I felt like, to your point exactly, we started hitting all of these different marks of the type of stories we want to tell and the type of people we want to invite on the show to tell those stories. So that feels really good. It feels a lot more settled. It doesn't feel, and it wasn't like, as you all know, that we sit here in the room, you and I and Farah, and say, oh, we need to get now one person in food, the next one needs to be in tech, and then let's go back to culture. It's not like that at all. Yeah. As you know, it's pretty random.
And it doesn't work like that even from a schedule. It's tough to do that. I don't think that would have been...
It's conversations that we're having, things that probably are topical to some extent, and that we feel we need to cover, and then we think about guests that we feel will bring a perspective to the show and tell a story. So I'm very happy about that. That's the second part that I feel settled only this last year. I'm not in any way belittling guests that came the first year. The contrary, I think they were great because many of them took also a chance on us when the show was really kind of in its very early stage and formation. But I feel now that we do have a more cohesive approach.
Yeah, and I think, when you think of it from a content strategy perspective almost, is we talk about the mission and the vision kind of as pillars, right? And I think our vision was clear, but now I think because what I'm hearing when you describe that is like now we kind of understand our mission a little bit better too.
Yes.
To say, ultimately, this is what we're trying to develop, which is the starting point is a community that extends what the Lighthouse is doing, right? But then on top of that, it's also, as you said, arts and culture as a scene. But then, of course, there's an F&B element to it, and then there is entrepreneurship and all of that.
And they connect, right? These are connecting, right? The fissures connecting. So, I mean, most of these guests still tell their own story in those respective domains, but also many of those guests wind up being probably interested in all of those topics when you think about it, including you and I and Farah. I mean, you have, and when you and I, we were having discussion right now before we came up, the discussion did range from some things that touch probably on the restaurant business because we were sitting in a restaurant, the Lighthouse. We talked a little bit about, entrepreneurship. We talked a little bit about tech and the implications. We even talked about, cryptocurrency, some other podcasters. So that is a natural conversation that you and I had over 20 minutes. And when you think about it, so I find that very natural that a lot of people will take an interest in many of those topics. Now, two difficult things sometimes that I find challenging. One is we don't want to make it so general that for someone who has a deep interest in the topic, it sounds very broad and amorphous. By the same token, you don't want to make it so super technical where you lose a big chunk of the audience. So that's something I certainly think about when I'm asking my questions. And I know that you're thinking about that when you're producing the show at the end, ultimately, is how do you keep that balance? It needs to have depth, but you don't necessarily need to go sometimes so deep where you lose maybe 70% are just saying, I'm not following.
Yeah, I think also, one of the things that I say a lot actually is like a show that is for everyone doesn't work for anybody.
Yeah.
I do think that having a defined audience is an important aspect of a show, right, ultimately, or even a community, right? The community is centered around something.
Yeah.
And that's not to take anything away from anyone that doesn't either likes or doesn't like our show. But I think it's important to see, as you said, it's the flexibility of saying there's a range of things that we can talk about. And there might be a certain guest that maybe not everybody's in on. So, for example, an investor,
correct,
who we bring on often,
correct,
has a lot of roots in entrepreneurship. Occasionally, maybe an investor is interested in art, right? And every investor I think we've spoken to is interested in the F&B business generally,
for sure,
right?
Yes.
So they do link up at the end of the day, but maybe someone is not super keen on listening to an investor talk about how he decides to invest,
correct,
and that's okay, right?
Correct.
It doesn't every episode doesn't have to hit every spot.
That's a very good point.
But I think what is interesting, as you said, is ultimately now we know why we're doing it and who we're doing it for. And so that's a lot of the decisions now get made around that. So as you said, you're thinking of the first stage of saying who is a right guest that will bring value to the audience. And when I'm looking at it from a production side, there are times when I say I'm going to take this out because I don't think this brings value to anybody, right? Or this is too generic that it's not interesting.
Yeah.
And so I think that kind of, as you said, that kind of settling is where we are today, which I think is.
But there's also a very interesting aspect here, and you and I touched on this offline before we started today. We're talking about Tim Ferriss and his show, for example, and what made Tim Ferriss become so successful as a podcaster. I mean, he's successful as a writer and as a blogger, and one of the things that I'm very gratified about is after a certain while, you start feeling that the audience also trusts your perspective. In other words, they know that we would bring a guest. They may even know that guest, but I hope they trust that we are going to take an approach to this guest and particular questions that will be of interest to them. So there starts to be a direct relationship between the host and the audience, and not just with the guest. Let me be a bit more specific. We probably all do, Kara Swisher. I was thinking today, I was listening to her in the car. I know stuff about all her children.
Yeah.
I know stuff about her mother, Lucky. I know things about her medical doctor brother. And when she started a new show called Sway, one of the things that I trusted is I like Kara Swisher's perspective. And I would listen, although that show is a little bit more about power and politics and less about tech. I trust her perspective. So I'd listen to her having guests on that, frankly, otherwise I would not be interested in. And that's a very interesting kind of angle here, right? Is how much are you going for the guests, and how much are you going for the host's perspective?
It's remarkable how much feedback I get about you as an interviewer over just the show. And I think the show is a little bit unique on that front because it isn't only, and I think that this is exactly to your point, right? Which is it's just not only about the fact that there is a conversation happening between two people, but the fact that it's like, okay, no, I actually like the way he interviews, or I like how he gets in depth into something. Some of the reviews we've gotten from people who listen goes along those lines as well. And I think one of the reasons, to some degree, why we had this episode this year with Yusuf, where we turned the tables on you. I mean, we're doing this as well to some degree to that effect, but this is more about sort of how we're thinking about the show.
Yeah.
Whereas that was really about saying, let's do the same conversation, but let's put Hashem in the hot seat instead.
Yeah.
And part of the reason was that, I think, part of the reason why
very much
I'm glad we did that is because it is important to get to know you and how you think about stuff. And that can be attributing to your background, which is varied enough, which explains a lot of the interests you have.
Yes.
But it's also about kind of getting your perspective, because it's interesting to understand that sometimes. I think I have definitely had people listen to an interview and go like, well, why did Hashem do X or Y? Like ask a question, interrupt, something.
Yeah.
And I said, because there was a reason.
Yeah.
There was a reason. And I have actually watched people, what we call almost like a consumer journey, change their mind about how the show goes. We haven't changed anything, really speaking, but realize actually, I get it. I understand why. He's willing to listen, and the show is about the guest's journey, but at the same time, he doesn't let the person just run away with something because they're hammering an agenda at you.
And that's tricky, right? Because I think you don't want to sound disruptive. You don't want to sound disrespectful. And of course, the feedback, to some people, I probably do come across as a little too forceful in that sense. But I think for me, to exactly your point, it's less about not wanting to hear out the guest. And it's more to that if I have a feeling that the conversation is moving towards sort of, away from the main core topics of that particular person, their journey.
Or sometimes it's just they're not answering the question you've actually put up, right? So sometimes you are asking about a certain event that may have happened, and they're giving you I don't want to say everybody's doing it because they're giving you the PR speak, because it's not necessarily true.
But there's a bit of that
sometimes,
too, for sure.
So there's a little bit of that, but sometimes they're just trying to move around the question.
No, you're right, and that we have told guests before that look, listen to the show before you come, because frankly, if you do that, most likely, not even about us being happy or upset with it, it's not going to be a very successful show. And I feel like we do have to ask some hard questions. I don't think people should be uncomfortable, but I don't think the point is also to just have a touchy-feely, feel-good show and kind of gloss over hot topics and topics that we care about. And what I try to do in return is also be fairly open about my own views on those topics and how they affect me as a person. So we talked about issues of mental health. We talked about issues of anxiety, performance anxiety. We talked issues of, fear of failure in various terms.
Yeah, so for me, the episode of with Manal Ataya, who's the Director General of Sharjah Museums, for example. And, the conversation kind of, although you started to some degree there, actually was entirely about mental health and anxiety, and very little about sort of museum curation, which is fine. And I think there's so much value to be had when people are open about having these conversations, right? And your own contributions to that conversation.
Well, I had a pre-conversation with her, and this came up, and I was very clear in asking her whether she's comfortable for us to talk about the show, and she said, "I am, because I feel I have a platform." And we now as a show have a platform, and I want people to understand that these things are very much part of my everyday life, even though I'm successful, very successful, and even though I'm in the arts and so on and so forth. So that's what encouraged us, if you recall, to kind of go more in that direction. It's not that we don't disregard the art, but I thought that it's very important when you are documenting these journeys that to show people with their entire persona.
Yeah.
And in many cases, and she talked about this, it is a kind of anxiety that may have driven them to success, right?
Which
so that also needs to be talked about.
It's such a powerful thing, right?
Yeah.
If you think about how, even by the way, in her episode in particular, there was a conversation we had after, because the conversation went on for about an hour and something.
Yeah.
And we chose to focus on the fact that she was being open about it, right? It's not to take away from anything else, but because it's important. I think it's important to open up that conversation. This also reminds me, actually, interestingly, because I was looking at our sort of episode list from last year.
Yeah.
And I realized, one of the things that happened to us over the summer, well, not happened to us, but, is we chose to take a month off.
Yeah.
And I think it was interesting because, sometimes you look back at that and you think, actually, it's interesting. We're not just saying it. We're also looking at it ourselves.
Everybody's burnt
constantly.
out.
Yeah. And we reached a point where it was a combination of being burnt out, and we had guest fallout, and
Yes.
we were at a point where we're like, okay, we're going to have to put something together or whatever. Yes. And we all took a stop and said, actually, that's not why we do this show.
And I'm really glad you brought this up because one of the things that happened with guests falling out, which happens all the time, we could mitigate this risk by pre-recording 6 episodes, let's say, and this would never happen. And we very purposely, or at least I very purposely, may actually probably for you and Farah make it a bit more complicated. Don't do that. And I really don't do it for a reason. I do not feel that in such a fast-changing environment that we're in right now, especially in the middle of a pandemic, which is still not gone, by the way, is that I can have a view today that is necessarily as accurate or valid 3 months from now. And I don't want to preempt this. So yes, a month, 2, within reason, that makes sense. So the risk you run, however, is exactly what you said, which frankly is you run out of guests. And I think it was a very good, in my view, collective decision to say, you know what, let's just pause. Let's not try to just put a filler. Yeah. That's not how the show works. It's okay to take a break.
Yeah, and I think that's the correct phrase. We didn't want to do a filler. I think that drove the decision more than the fact
100%.
Where we said, okay, well, now we have to get a guest just because we have to put an episode out. Yeah. Yes, I admit, and we were just talking about this, right? There is a luxury in that.
100%.
Which maybe that's not available all the time.
I think that goes back to the original mission of the show, which, without overusing that word, I think the authenticity of the message is really important to us, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it goes hand in hand with the story of the Lighthouse and how the Lighthouse has started, and being an entrepreneurial and going through this journey with its ups and downs and bringing people on the show that share this journey, that may have touched the Lighthouse or not, or been touched by the Lighthouse or not. And I think that it's important for that conversation to stay authentic. And I think if you start doing fillers or start feeling a particular pressure to put a particular type of guest on the show, or to your point earlier where you're saying, well, we preview the show every time by saying, tech, food, arts and design, but guys, you know what, we haven't done arts and culture, so now we need to find someone. No, we've done 3 or 4 episodes in a row that were just about technology this year, or tech entrepreneurship, let's call it this way. And that's okay. I mean, that was at the moment something that happened, and obviously cryptocurrency happened, and that was also something we want to talk to our guests about. And I felt strongly also when it came to entrepreneurship that one of the maybe less understood aspects are you come at it from different angles. So we had done the entrepreneur. I wanted to do the investor. I wanted to do the ones that maybe carry both hats, wear both hats. They invest and they're operators, and I'm one of them. I mean, I invest in companies and I operate a company as well. And I wanted to show people all of this diversity of that ecosystem. That was very deliberate. We had Faraz, we had Khaled, we had a bunch of people. I mean, Faraz used to invest,
correct.
Now operates a company.
Yeah, and I think also these kind of conversations, and when you were just saying now that there are different sides of this angle, and we try to look at all of them. And one of the things that we do once the interview is done, generally, because we don't air the whole interview, we almost never do.
Correct.
But we turn around and say, okay, what angle of this is the interesting one? So we do a little bit of that work happens in the questions, but then a lot of it happens later to say, actually this was the key, most important, most interesting thing that they said that is of value.
Yes.
Right. So I thought it was really interesting. We had Khaled from Noah Capital who was on.
Khaled Talhouni,
Talhouni. And he was, of course,
that was a really good episode.
Yeah,
he was also very honest.
So it was a very interesting investor perspective. But really, for me, the question that made that episode was when you asked him, well, do you want to be an entrepreneur? He's like, yeah, I'd love to, but I know my skills enough to know that I'll never be a good entrepreneur.
Yeah. Can you see yourself at some point being on the other side of this trade? So you have people, again, we keep using the same example, but like, Mark Andreessen, who was obviously an operator, very, very successful for many years, and then went the VC route. You've had people kind of going both sides. Do you see yourself ever starting your own company as an operating tech business or any business?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to, and I've tried a couple very early right after college and failed very quickly, but I am a terrible operator. I am like truly terrible.
Well, you're operating a company now, by the
a
way.
very small company. Like the scale of operations is reasonably small, and is like, you know, it's cerebral in nature, which is, it kind of works in my head. Like, and so whereas like, you know, and this is why I wish I could be like a founder. Maybe, who knows, like in the future, but like realizing my own strengths and weaknesses, like operating large scale teams is probably not my strength. And it's not managing people. I love managing people actually, like, but it's more, and working with people, but it's more like, you know, that methodical operational drive is definitely not my strength. And one of the reasons why I love my job is because I live vicariously through the founders we invest in. I see them like building stuff.
My favorite part where he called me Renaissance man, but anyway, I digress. But I'm just thought you put it out there. Maybe he didn't say it on that episode, but he said it on the episode, I think when
you were on his show.
When I was on his, yeah. I just want to keep repeating that until it actually sticks. But I'm just joking.
So Renaissance man, what I'm trying to understand, but you know, and I think it's wonderful when the guest is open and honest enough to do that. But it's also interesting because someone would look at it and say, oh, he's an investor. I don't know if I would get anything out of that conversation. One of the things we try to do, at least, is to say, no, as you said, we want to bring the entire perspective. But you can get the fact that an investor feels vulnerable and honest, even when it doesn't seem like an investor is a role where that kind of conversation
And
might
most
happen.
really good ones do, right? I mean, now I don't know if they want to necessarily share this, but what I really liked about this particular episode is exactly what you just said. I mean, really most good operators and investors know that, you know, that this is all part of the conversation. And it's not about coming across as invincible. It's not coming across as... Everybody knows that the investing business, certainly in the venture capital investing business, it's the law of numbers. You're going to invest in 100 companies and 5 companies are going to, what they call, return the fund. And I think he was kind of alluding to that in a sense, but also alluding that it's not just investing, it's also managing. You manage a business, and they're not always the same. A guy that's a good operator or a girl is not always the same a good manager. So these are all different skill sets that have to come to the picture. So that was an interesting one. And I mean, certainly when we had Faraz on also Faraz Jalbout, which I think is 1 or 2 episodes before that, which gave us the other side of this coin, which is he started as an investor for many years and now has switched to start his own company with its own challenges. I'm an investor in this company and I know the challenges that come, generally speaking, with starting your own company when you used to be the guy who writes the checks and calling these entrepreneurs and saying, what have you got for me today? Yeah. It's a very different, radically different perspective. And it's nice to have those types of guests that are able to give us a diversity of thought.
Absolutely. I'll jump out on that also because there was another thing that I really liked about Faraz's interview, and it kind of goes to his mission anyway, so I know he's kind of really doubling down on it. But you know, this conversation of saying, you know, financial independence, understanding finance, is something everybody should be doing.
Yeah.
And having conversations about finance. Yeah.
It's starting to emerge here, but if you look at other markets, the US or Western markets in general, what's very interesting now is that you have a whole generation of new investors that are between the ages of 18 to, 30, who are talking about investing on a daily basis.
That's correct.
Investing in markets, investing in crypto, investing in real estate. And you can invest in any asset class now, which I think we should touch on. But
yeah, for sure.
I mean, you have a whole generation of people who are talking about investing. To me, that is good. That is good for society.
Why is that good for society?
Because being financially literate is a positive thing.
His analogy was the fact that we never had financial conversations around the dinner table when we were growing up, and that needs to change, right? That needs to change for us as a region. That needs to change just in general, because I know people, or at least are really trying to change that conversation to say, I'm trying to teach my kids how to invest and what it means, right? And I'm even if it's a small amount of money, you say, here, take it, go invest, try it out, right? I know you mentioned you told your son, for example, to do research on Bitcoin and Ethereum, for example, right?
Poor kid, yeah.
Yeah.
He's going to need a shrink any day now. Yeah. But that's okay. Yeah. He probably would have needed a shrink anyway.
But I'm curious as a follow-up, like, how was the presentation?
So what I've asked him to do is, two things. One, there's a Bitcoin thing, and then I've asked him to present to me 3 different companies. And he presented Spotify,
interesting,
Tesla, and Shopify. And I don't know, I should say this on the record, because one day he listened to it and he'll get a big head. It was excellent. It was very thorough. He was able to understand the macro issues that these companies are facing. And I think he kind of got the business model. And it was a casual conversation, and he has his iPad, and I told him to do some research, come back. But it's partially so to your point, I grew up in a very academic environment where you looked at everything in frameworks because my parents were academicians. Business was not part of the dinner conversation. And I wanted him to be able to still develop frameworks. I mean, the theoretical framework is very important, but I also want him to understand the commercial angle to life and to what we do. And that's not something I certainly grew up appreciating. I appreciated at a later stage. So that was important. So that was the conversation. And it just brings me on something completely unrelated, but talking about guests of ours that we brought that I felt very strongly brought a different perspective. One thing that came to my mind was that we had a number of female guests, and Sandy comes to mind, and Nada comes to mind. Both brought out a very interesting angle of Arab women growing in different parts of the world where they felt as an outsider and how they've taken that and made it a strength of theirs. And that's very powerful. And both spoke quite openly about this as well. I mean, Nada grew up in Japan as a daughter of Lebanese immigrants, and Sandy grew up in Sweden, and then Finland as a daughter of Lebanese immigrants as well. And if you remember some of the conversations, so interesting. Sandy, for example, saying how she didn't want to bring her friends home because she felt it was too Arab and too much food.
The hard part was my family was different, obviously.
Yeah.
So I noticed today that I went completely the opposite. So I found my family being very strange because they were very loud, that we
comparatively,
ate different,
of course.
100%, and we ate different things. It was all about family, a lot about family time. They were very included in everything we did. My mom had to know everything. It was that typical Lebanese family that just
Arab family in general.
Exactly, yeah. And it just stood out from what my friends had to go through. So
Did you feel a sense of shame? Like, I don't want to bring my friends home because they're going to figure out this Arab family that...
Yeah, or more anger. Okay. I think I took that out on my parents. So I used to fight with my mom very often, every weekend. And I started to work at a very young age because I kept fighting with my mom. So I had to make sure to be away from home. And I think it was just because I found me being so different. And so I had the two identities and I had to figure it out.
But what was nice about that also is, today she turns around and says, well, actually, I have the Swede mentality of efficiency combined with the Lebanese love for food.
Yes.
And that's the work she does every single day.
So that outsider mentality turning into a strength and co-opting and appropriating your life into something sometimes in your own career. I mean, in both of their cases, in their professional careers and their creative journey, I think that is really special. I didn't grow up as an outsider. I grew up in a relatively homogenous city in Cairo as an Egyptian. But I was in German school, so I had a bit of a glimpse of how that can feel like. In my graduating class, I was a minority because most of them were German at that point. And I find that kind of play a very interesting one. We'll continue our review and share more of our guest highlights from 2021 right after the short break. Welcome back. You're listening to the Lighthouse Conversations with me, Hashem Matter, and our producer, Chirag Desai.
Okay, so one more highlight I want to kind of shout out to was the episode we had with Hattem Matter, Matter Farm.
That was fun.
Again, I'm stepping out of my producer hat and trying to think like a listener.
Yeah.
And I can almost look at that episode and go like, oh, this must be a lot about smoked meats. And I think that was 5 minutes in the conversation.
Not even,
right?
It was chic, fantastique, as he called it. Yeah. It was all over the place and a lot less about smoked meats. It was
very little. Yeah, it was very little. And I think it was more about sort of his relationship with his father. And it was about him as a father today, which I thought honestly were fantastic kind of insights into what that might be like.
Yeah.
Because I think it's a conversation people don't really have so much. I know he's open about it and I know he talks about it occasionally. And I know you pushed him on it a couple of times to turn around and say, I think you should tell me more about this.
I did because he has a very active social media presence and he is well liked and followed. And I did know, I had only met him a few times before, but felt very strongly that there's another side that he doesn't share, it just doesn't come up.
Yeah.
Because most of them talk about the pitmaster and the barbecue. And I'm like, that's great. And you'd think because we are connected to the Lighthouse that this is a conversation you want to have. But I was like, no, but there's a lot going on with you as a person that we want to discuss. And I felt was very open about it. He kind of owned a lot of these things, but also, which I really appreciated, brought wit and humor to the conversation, which I just think in a heavy year, again, I mean, we are going on to year 3 of pandemic. I mean, a little bit of humor and some laughter is very helpful. I feel like it's a bit like the whole thing of like taking a break, right? I mean, it's just, you need to kind of take a breath. And this is coming from someone who's not used to doing that. So I feel like I appreciated when some of our guests brought in a little bit of that kind of sense of humor and that sensibility, not taking themselves overly seriously into the conversation.
I mean, I have no friends, no social life. I've given up my jiu-jitsu, my pretend jiu-jitsu career, my pretend skydiving career.
No boyfriends,
no, nothing. No, nothing. You know what I mean? And if you're and no sleep.
Yeah. I'm not going to be your friend, but because this is like exhausting.
We're going to be eventually.
This is it. This is a 1 hour conversation.
And then the last.
I want to be very clear where this is going. This is not turning into more than this.
You tricked me.
لا ما انت بتقول لي you're looking for friends وانا الحقيقة مش فاضي.
مش فاضي لك.
خلص يعني.
So last year we talked a little bit about kind of what we wanted to focus on for the year. Within the constraints of the year, I think we did okay.
We definitely did. Thanks to you guys for the most part.
How do you feel about the coming year? Are there things you want to double down on, focus on, or bring into the conversation?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that we are interested in. I am interested in personally. One of the interesting things, of course, conversations that happened towards the end of last year was that feeling that Dubai, with all the challenges that you saw everywhere, really came out on top. There's a big change now of the work week to a different work week than it used to be before. And I think Dubai is making a very concerted effort to put itself on the map as a international player and not just a regional player. Of course, they are a very important regional player. And that brings a more global perspective to things, including to us, because as you change this work week, you're connected to other parts of the world that follow the same work week. And I think that is healthy, I really do, in a world that is more and more connected. And I feel like even for our show, I feel like we've gone from a comfort zone of Dubai in the very early stages to a comfort zone of the region in maybe our second year. A lot of guests from Egypt, some Saudi, Lebanon, etc. And this is not about let's take the show global, but more that I would like to hear multiple perspectives from different people. And of course, the show will always be connected to this part of the world, to the Middle East, and we want to keep that. But I feel we can get those perspectives from all around, including people that may not live in the region. I think that would be a nice thing to see, especially in a world where, I had some trepidations about doing this over Zoom, and I still do. I frankly still prefer an in-person show. But I got more comfortable with the setting, and that enables us to do many, many more shows that we couldn't do and bring many more guests that you couldn't. I'm not Tim Ferriss, but if you recall, one of the things he brought up in his review of his own show recently is he said, well, if you're on Zoom, you will get many more guests and it becomes much easier to schedule. And there is some truth to that. And one of the conversations I'm interested in is, say, from people from outside of the region, how they feel about this region, if they're connected to it. Because I don't think we've brought much of that perspective yet. We've been very focused on regional stories, which is at the core. But I think broadening it out and hearing from the other side would be interesting as well.
Yeah, and I think, again, it goes back to what we're trying to do, which is just because we have the guest who doesn't necessarily live in the region, so to speak, doesn't mean that there can't be a Middle Eastern conversation to be had, right? So we can still bring those perspectives. We can still talk about it, like you said, them viewing us in a certain, or how do they view the region? And of course, we would generally pick someone who has a lot of familiarity with the region and so on. So that profile does exist. We had Chris Khalifa, right, last year. The year before actually. But again, Egyptian roots, living in New York, and what 100%. That was like, and there is absolute value in those conversations just 100%. As much, right? So it doesn't take away from that conversation.
No, I agree. So and then the other thing that I thought was interesting is, as we've been looking at kind of those trends, food, culture, art, obviously tech. We've been bringing people from those different worlds in to speak to us. I think it'll be interesting to become even messier and bring people in that maybe do a combo of these things. You know, so we've had a recent conversation which is going to air about food, but also about culture and really the history of food. So I think the more comfortable we get, the more those lines become even more blurred, and the more, to me at least, of a fulfilling conversation it is. Now, it's going to be upon us to make the conversation streamlined and not meandering, but I think it brings in a fuller perspective.
Oh, there's a wealth of it, as we've seen,
yeah.
I mean, in the conversations. Yeah. I think one thing I'm looking forward to is kind of pushing us out of a comfort zone from a location perspective as well. So yes. I know we've talked about this for a couple of years, and unfortunately we haven't played on it too much. But we've talked about sort of, what if we didn't sit in the studio, and what if we went to one of the locations? What if we did something? And I think that can also be...
I agree with that.
It can be interesting. We have to think it through and work it out.
We spoke a lot about the slurping sounds of Barbara Streisand eating the soup, and I feel like we still haven't done that. It doesn't need to be a Barbara Streisand, but I think you're right. We have spoken a lot about this, and I think hopefully now with also multiple Lighthouse locations and all of that, we'll be willing to be a bit more daring. I've probably been a little bit more hesitant. That's the Germanic side of mine. But I think that's something we should explore. I agree with that.
I think when we started, we had looked at it as almost as events, right? And saying, as we had with, for example, Zaki Nasiba or something, right? Like where we said, okay, we're going to bring a conversation and you're going to get to watch. And I think for me, what is now obviously has to be more partly because of what's happening, but also because I think there's value in doing the in-person thing, sitting face-to-face, but doing it over a meal instead of doing it over just in the studio.
And by the way, in Yes Bay in Abu Dhabi, we have a library bar.
Well, there you go.
I cannot imagine a better space to have this conversation with some unintended consequences I'm not going to go into now. But I mean, I'm just saying that is quite powerful.
I feel like that should be where our next review is.
Yeah. So maybe a year from now we'll be there. Farah, what do you think? We even have a bar menu. I mean, should we give him the full menu or just the bar menu? I feel the bar menu is more than enough. Okay, fine. We'll give you the full menu. Chirag, it's fine.
I haven't said anything. And thankfully, there's no camera working that records my face right now, so nobody knows what I would do.
I do. It's forever etched in my memory, but yes.
Well, you might as well get used to that then.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Thank you very much, Hashem. I think that was good.
Thanks,
it's good to review.
And on to a new year. Happy New Year to
guys.
The audience as well. Thank you. A big thank you to all our guests who joined us over the last year, and to you for listening and sending us your reviews and comments. You can find us on Instagram at @thelighthouse_AE or leave us a rating in Apple Podcasts and Spotify. We'll be back with a new episode in 2 weeks, so see you then.